We've been talking or looking at the world through the eyes of God, trying to understand a little bit more about what God expects as opposed to what we see in the world. And in order to see that, we need to see how God sees the world. We need to see what He says about these things, that the world thinks differently from the way that God does. And remember that God's thoughts are not, our thoughts are not God's thoughts, nor are our ways His ways, but as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are His ways higher than our ways. And so we need to keep that in mind. And we're going to talk this morning, though last Sunday we talked about marriage and divorce. This time we're going to talk about scriptural marriage itself, the relationships, and the responsibilities of those in the marriage relationship. As pointed out last week, far too many marriages end in divorce simply because someone did not take the time to study God's will in the matter as it is revealed in the Bible. Had they done so, they would have found that God has given definite responsibilities to both the man and the woman in scriptural marriage. Healthy marriages are good for couples' mental and physical health. They are also good for children. Growing up in a happy home protects children from mental, physical, educational, and social problems. And so getting married is a sober responsibility, or results in sober responsibilities. And getting married should not be taken lightly, a marriage should not be entered into lightly. And yet people are marrying and divorcing and marrying again according to their own will. If they think they're in love with somebody, they marry them without giving any attention or consideration to the seriousness of the marriage compact or the marriage contract or the institution as God has given it to us and as He describes it in His Word. Usually a man marries a woman hoping she will never change because he's looking on the outside. A woman generally, when she marries a man, oh yeah, there are things about him that she doesn't like, but she's hoping he will change. So he hopes she never changes, and she hopes he does change, but of course in different ways. And we need to just be careful about who we marry. And so the best thing that we can do is prepare ourselves, those who are not married, but those of us who are, we need to think about these things from time to time so that we can convey these things to others who are contemplating marriage. The scriptural husband is the head of the wife. What does it mean to be the head? I believe it means simply to make decisions affecting the entire family and to lead by example. It's the husband. It's not a democracy. Now, if a husband wants to get feedback from the wife and kids, that's one thing. But it's not a democracy. Now, the man is the head of the wife, and therefore he is the head of the family. He's the one that makes the decisions. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. In 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. And so it's God, Christ, man, woman. Does that mean she's the low person on the totem pole? Well, it doesn't really mean that. It doesn't mean that she has fewer rights than he does. But it's a reminder that she was created after the man and for the man, and is to therefore support the man, especially the man to whom she is married. And so he is the head of his wife, and that he is the one to make the decisions that affect their future and their it affects them in every way that we might consider. We'll talk more about that in a second. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and his himself. its Savior. And so Christ and the body, and that's used here as a figure for the husband and wife. Actually, Paul has been talking in the first epistle about the church, and now he is using the husband-wife relationship to discuss or to teach about the church-Christ relationship. But many people today need to understand this in reverse. We understand, at least those among churches of Christ generally understand, though there certainly are exceptions, that whatever Christ has authorized the body to do, that it may do, and nothing more may be done by the body, the church. Either, and the only way the church can act is on the local level. Universal church cannot act. It has no means by which to function as a unit, because there's no organizational framework for the universal church to do anything. But the local church has a framework, and it is through this framework that the church does as God instructs. And the same thing is true with the husband-wife relationship. He makes the decisions, and she supports him in those decisions. Again, we'll talk more about that when we get to talking about the scriptural wife. The scriptural husband is to love, that is, see to the needs of his wife. And if he does this in the making of his decisions are certainly going to be in her best interest. Only God is more important to a man than his wife. Second in importance to worshiping God in spirit and in truth is seeing to the needs of his wife. God created man first. God was created in the image, or man was created in the image of God. And then God took a rib from the man and created woman and brought her to the man as a help suitable to him. She is to help him, to support him in life's endeavors. But he is to see to her needs, because he is the head. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Now there's a difference between being firm and being harsh. We can be firm in our decisions without being harsh in the carrying out of those decisions. This does not mean he has a right to make arbitrary decisions. He is to think long and hard about the decisions that he makes, and he has the moral authority to enforce them. Not by brute force, but by moral suasion, as it is sometimes called. He sits down with his wife and his kids and says, okay, here's what I've decided, and here's why I have decided this. Therefore, this is what we are going to do as a family unit. We're not going to be doing these things over here anymore, because those things are not in our best interest. These things over here are in our best interest. Therefore, those are the things we're going to do. That's the way we're going to conduct ourselves as a family. The husband makes that decision. His decisions should clearly be in the best interest of his family. He doesn't make selfish decisions. He makes selfless decisions. And I hope that my mask does not prevent you from distinguishing between those two words. Not selfish, but selfless. He takes himself out of the equation except as a part of the family unit. In Ephesians 5, verse 25 beginning, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Notice the degree to which Christ loved the church. That he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish, the church. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. The church is the corporate body of Christ. And the wife is like that body only in that she is in subjection to, or to be in subjection to, her husband. But he is to treat her in the same way that he would treat his own body. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh. Now, there are masochists. There are people that do harm to themselves, but usually we think these are people with mental problems. But a healthy, sound man, a healthy man with a sound mind does not hate his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. He loves the church corporately, and he loves the members of the church individually, and the husband ought to love his wife even as his own body. Just as he takes care of his own body, he is to take care of his wife. Just as he nourishes and cherishes his own body, he is to nourish and cherish his wife. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound. And I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself. And so, as he's giving this analogy of Christ and the church, by using the husband and wife, he wants to make sure that they understand. He's talking about the husband and wife relationship as God intended it, not as it might exist in this or that home. And so there's two things that he's teaching here. The way that Christ loves the church, the way that the church is in subjection to Christ, and the way that he loves his wife, and she is in subjection to him. So, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself. You know, Jesus said, I don't have it on the screen, but you'll remember this. In Matthew 22 and Mark chapter 12, the great commandment of all is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. And the second is like unto it, you will love your neighbor as yourself. Even your neighbor is an extension of yourself. If your neighbor is an extension of yourself, how much more your wife? Your wife is your closest neighbor. And you are to see to her well-being in any and all decisions you make. Take her well-being and the well-being of your children into consideration. And that's what love means. Basically, when it talks about man loving his wife, he is to see to her needs just as he would see to the needs of his own body. Third, he is to honor his wife. Though he is the head, he is to honor her. His social life revolves around her. She is his center. That's the way it should be. His life revolves around her socially. And he does nothing socially that will hurt the family in any way. Either physically, mentally, emotionally, or psychologically. In 1 Peter 3 verse 7, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. Generally speaking, that's the case. Certainly there are exceptions. Since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Now, the heirs with you of the grace of life, I believe that's talking about this life, not the next life, because of the next statement, that your prayers be not hindered. We're not going to need to pray in heaven. He's not talking necessarily about heirs with you of heaven, but heirs with the grace of life. God gave marriage for the betterment of mankind. It was not good that the man should be alone, God said. So he created a help suitable for her when he created woman. And together, Adam and Eve would have been heirs of the grace of life had they not sinned by eating of the fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But now that Christ has come, the effects of that first sin are reversed where faithful Christians are concerned. Heirs of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Sometimes people wonder, why hasn't God answered my prayers? Well, it may very well be because your life is not right with Him as far as your relationship to your spouse is concerned. So we always need to be examining ourselves to make sure that what I'm doing is right in every respect, in all of my relationships with human beings, especially in my relationship to my wife and my children. I need to be doing the right thing, the thing that is in their best interest. For He is to provide for His family. The family does not exist to serve Him. Generally speaking, a man and wife get married. They don't have kids so they have somebody to serve them. Now, eventually, the children will grow up and they will be responsible to some extent for their parents, but they'll always be responsible to their parents. But one day, according to Paul, I don't remember the verse, but I can get that for you afterward. The parents are to lay up for their children, but one day, children are going to be in a position where they will need to reciprocate as parents become feeble. Nursing homes, assisted living, things of that nature. Sometimes, not always, that's in the best interest of a feeble parent or grandparent. Not always, but sometimes. And of course, one needs to be careful in that regard, because we've all heard, I guess you've heard about the McMartins out there in California had this child care facility, and they were arrested for child abuse. Had all these children in there, they were abusing them. You need to check those things out. He's to provide for his family. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 30, but if any does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, his wife and his children, and any grandparents that might be living with him, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now keep in mind what an unbeliever was in the first century. In the 21st century, an unbeliever might believe in God, just not in Jesus Christ. And so in one sense, a Jew would be an unbeliever in that he's not a Christian. He doesn't believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. He's not confessed the faith because he has no faith in Jesus Christ. He is an unbeliever. But even unbelievers take care of their own. Remember, Jesus said, do not love your brethren only, or your neighbor only, back there in Matthew 5, but love your enemy also. If you love your neighbor only, well, the publicans and sinners do that. But if you do not love your own well enough to provide for them, provide for their needs, you've denied the faith, because that's what the faith teaches, the Bible, the New Testament, the gospel. And he's worse than an unbeliever. Fifth, he is to train his children. If the children do not learn to be responsible in the home, where will they learn it? You know, when I was down at Florida College, there seemed to have been some young people to me. I was 26 when I was down there, 25, nearly 26. 19-year-old men and women, basically, who apparently had been sent down there hoping the school could straighten them out. Now, if you ain't trained them up in the way they should go by the time they're 18, ain't nobody else going to be able to do that. The Catholic Church says that if you give them a child till age 7, he'll be a Catholic for the rest of their life. Now, there's exceptions to that, and that's an exaggeration. But the Catholic Church really trains their young people with the catechism and all that. And they celebrate that first communion. The daughter, she gets a nice new dress, and the son, he gets a nice new suit, and they go and have their first communion. And it's a red letter day for them. Why? And why do they have gone through that catechism? They are ready to be devout Catholics. But we need to train our children so that at the appropriate time, they will become Christians. Now, I know sometimes we want that to happen earlier than it does. And we just got to trust that maybe my training is simply not over. It doesn't say you train up a child for a few years. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Children need to be prepared for the disappointments in life as well as its enjoyments. Let me say that before I go to the scripture. That's a part of training your children. All right. Here's what you have to look forward to as you become an adult. At 15, generally, they get their learner's permit and they're learning to drive, and at 16 they get their driver's license. And there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes I believe some people go overboard. When they turn 16, then all they get their driver's license, they give them the keys to a brand new car. Something they ain't never worked for and cannot possibly appreciate. And when you do things like that, you're training a child to think that the world revolves around them and owes them a living. We cannot do that. We need to teach them that there are going to be enjoyments in this life by giving them privileges, new privileges as they get older. But also, along with those privileges, give them responsibilities. And sometimes we may have to take those responsibilities away from them temporarily, or the liberties, the freedoms. And they're going to be disappointed, but that's the way life is. There are disappointments in life. Let's look at a few passages. Proverbs 22, verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, when is that training over? Many people think, when he leaves home and goes to college, the training is over. I'm not so sure about that. Any kind of information we need to convey to him, anything we perceive that he does not really, or she does not really appreciate or understand about life and about their responsibilities to God, we need to communicate that to them, no matter how old they are. And he doesn't put a time limit on it. Train up your child in the way he should go, even when he is old. That doesn't mean even when he is a teenager. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Yes, he may make some poor decisions as he goes out into the cold, cruel world. But if you train him up, eventually, I believe, he's going to regret those decisions, realize that you taught him better than that. And like the prodigal son of Luke chapter 15, he'll come to himself and return home again with hat in hand, asking to be forgiven. This obviously includes how to worship and serve God acceptably. Young men need to be prepared for manhood, and young women for womanhood. And I think there's too little of that. Among other things, sexual abstinence before marriage is to be stressed. And I know I've said this a lot, but I don't believe I can say it too often. Far too many dates where a young man and a young girl are all by themselves consist in exploring one another's bodies rather than one another's minds. And we need to tell them this is not good. You explore their bodies when you're married. That's what the word "no" means. It's after you're married, then you become familiar with the body and more familiar with the body, and eventually you have children. It is to be hoped. Sexual abstinence before marriage is to be straight. It's ridiculed today. People, young girls who are virgins are ridiculed. That's sad. Young men especially are ridiculed if they maintain their purity. They also need to be prepared for all the other temptations in life, else they will have no defense mechanism. They need to know what's coming and how to deal with what's coming when it comes. And if Colossians 3:21, fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. The New International Version says embitter. Do not embitter your children. I believe too often training involves an embittering of their children, a harshness that embitters them. You should not want them to feel as though they cannot please you. I believe that's what he means by lose heart. The word may refer to, the word exasperate, may refer to nagging or belittling of the children. A sense of failure, this losing heart, a sense of failure inbred into children could poison their entire lifetimes. Going through life thinking they can't please anybody in doing anything, and thus they never step up to the plate where, in any situation where somebody needs to, and face the realities of life. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The word provoke here implies being so heavy-handed and unreasonable with children that they are driven to a helpless state of frustration and anger. And in verse 1, I don't have it on the chart, but in verse 1, Paul does not say, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for I said so. But children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. That's what we need to teach them. It's not my way or the highway, it's the Lord's way. And we need to accept it. This is what the Lord wants me to do. This is what the Lord wants you to do. I'm going to do what he wants me to do. I pray that you will do what he wants you to do. The scriptural wife is to submit to her husband. This does not mean, of course, that she is to have no say in the decision making. But when all is said and done, the decision is his. He may be her head, but she may be his neck. Sometimes in the decision-making process, and he should be willing to get input from the wife, even from the children, depending on the circumstance. And she gives her input. And maybe helps him to think this thing through in a way that it needs to be thought through. But the decision is his. And she needs to abide by it. Wives, submit to your husbands as fitting in the Lord. Notice the qualification, as is fitting in the Lord. You want to make sure that what decision he has made, as far as it affects you is concerned, is in the Lord. And again, well, we'll talk about that in a second. Don't want to get ahead of myself. Ephesians 5:22 and 24, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Everything here is in reference to the marriage. She is to obey God rather than man, wherever there is a conflict. I was talking to a man who was so unreasonable years ago. And it was because he and his wife were members of another congregation that she came to believe, and I agreed with her, that congregation was institutionally minded and doing things that ought not to do with money from its treasury. And so she left and she identified with us. In Alabama there, Hamilton. But her husband was so unreasonable And she said he changed. He became a man that she had never known because he refused to accept the truth that she had accepted. And in our discussion, he said, she's my wife. She's supposed to do like I tell her. I said, even if you tell her to rob a bank? Yes, sir. And when a man makes a statement like that, you know he's not thinking clear-headed. He's not even thinking at all. That's a defense mechanism of one who is not willing to accept the truth. 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Even a Christian woman married to a man who is not a Christian is to be subject to him. Again, she must obey God rather than man. And as a result, she conducts herself in accordance to God's wishes and not his wishes, her husband's wishes. She might have more influence teaching by example than by the spoken word. I believe sometimes, you know the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I believe too often we try to hold somebody's head under the water. Well, instead of drinking, they drown. And I believe you can go too far in that. And sooner or later, especially a wife married to an unbeliever, has got to say, well, I'll just shut up for a while and be a faithful Christian. If he has any questions, he can ask, and I'll talk with him about it. But at some point, I think she needs to depend only on her conduct. She's to respect her husband. He is to be respected for his position as her head. And I tell you, a woman should be able to determine before she gets married whether she can respect him as her head after they get married. If you can't tell that, don't marry that individual. If a young man has no respect for his young lady friend before marriage, he'll have little respect to no respect for her afterward. And the reverse is true of her. She needs to respect him. In Ephesians 5:33, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Of course, he can make it far easier for her to respect him if it is obvious to her that he loves her and cherishes her as his own body. Notice how he spends more time here talking about the man than the woman. I think it is only natural that the woman will love her husband when she sees that his world, his social life at least, revolves around her. And he puts her on a pedestal. He honors her in his decision making. She does not make snap judgments as to his decisions. She is to love, give tender affection to her husband and children. In Titus 2, verses 3 and 4, older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train, the older women are to train the young women to love their husbands and children. Now the word for love here is not agape. It's not the word we generally use, or not the word in John 3:16, for God so loved the world, etc. But it's the word is philandros, lover of men. In 2 Peter 3, verse 6, you have brotherly kindness, which is related to it. It's Philadelphia. And so philo, that's one kind of love. Agape is another kind of love. Eros is even another kind of love. And then there's storge, which is natural affection, which women are certainly to have for their children. Love their husbands, obviously not talking about romantic love, because the children there being an object of the same verb. But it has to do, again, with tender affection. Fourthly, she is to be a worker at home. And some translations say keeper at home, and I think some have misunderstood that. Titus 2, 3, and 5, to be self-controlled. This is a continuation of what we read. Older women are to train the young women. To be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. Adam Clark had this comment, and I like it well. I just wanted to share it with you. I didn't think I could synthesize it and express it anywhere near as well as he does. A woman who spends much time in visiting must neglect her family. The idleness, dirtiness, impudence, and profligacy of the children will soon show how deeply criminal the mother was in rejecting the apostles' advice. They are to be keepers of the house, or keepers at home, or workers at home, not only staying in the house and keeping the house, but working in the house. A woman may keep the house very closely and yet do little in it for the support and comfort of the family. And I tell you, this made me think of the worthy woman in Proverbs 31. Now, I'm going to read that because it's a lengthy reading. Proverbs 31, beginning in verse 10. Just when you get a chance, read that and see how God, through Solomon, or through the proverb there, I'm not sure if Solomon wrote that particular proverb, how she spends her day. Not only days, but nights as well. Or working it. Doesn't mean she can't work outside the home. Keep in mind that in the first century, it was very difficult for a woman to support herself, and not much that a woman would be hired to do. Lydia, in Acts chapter 16, was an exception. She was a seller of purple. Anybody could sell dye. But that's what she chose to do to support herself and her family, which is a family of all women. And but you know, Proverbs 31 talks about the activity of the woman in the home. Today, it is very difficult with the economy the way it is for a family to get by on a one-parent income. And I believe we need to take that into consideration. She is to keep or rule the house. The NIV says, manage their homes. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. For some have already turned aside to follow Satan. Now, here's the situation that he is dealing with here in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Widows were being supported out of the church treasury. But widows were being supported out of the church treasury, did not need to be supported out of the church treasury. And so Paul, in his letter to Timothy, qualifies the woman who can be supported. She had to be 60 years old and a worker reported of her good works. Younger widows, he says, refuse because being idle, having nothing to do but having their sustenance come from the church, they'll wander about and visit this family and that family and get involved in gossip, and that's probably just true of men. I remember that Andy Griffith episode where the men started gossiping, and the women said, "See, it's not just women." That's what he's talking about being turned aside to follow Satan. They become busybodies, the younger widows, if they are supported by the church. So he says, no, let them get married, bear children, keep house, or manage their homes in the NIV. Closing observations. Those not eligible for marriage should not marry. Those eligible should not marry someone who is not eligible. Those in scriptural marriages should be faithful unto death. And those in unscriptural marriages should get out of them.